I'm going to make a number of short videos where I will take you through reading Homer's Odyssey Book 1. That is, for those who have done at least 1 year of classical Greek, I'm going to take you through word by word and explain some of the grammar and the vocabulary. Before we embark on that, I want to say just a few words about the work itself. So it was probably composed around about 750, generally thought to have been composed after the Iliad and possibly not by the same person. It's an old tradition that goes back to an earlier period, probably containing elements that go back to about 1200 BC. It's written in a rather strange dialect. It's an old Ionic dialect with traces of Aeolic, but it's an artificial language. It's not a language that was ever spoken. It's a poetic, epic language. And therefore, even after you've spent a year or so studying classical Greek, it can be a little bit daunting to suddenly start into Homer. A couple of key features I mentioned very briefly. We'll see examples as we go. There's a lack of contraction of vowels, both in verbs and nouns. The augments are often omitted in past tenses. You get alternate spellings and forms. So, for example, chronides and chronion. Consonants are often doubled. Often the reason for doing that is because of the meter. You'll also see variations of the genitive masculine singular second declension. So your usual oi, or oo I should say, that you normally get in Attic, you will see in place of that oyo, there were original digammas and wut sounds in this. The next stage of that is it contracts to o, and then the two omicrons contract to oo, which is what you're more used to. You also have a lot of temesis, although it's technically not temesis because the verb and the preposition were at this stage not conjoined in order to be broken up, which is what temesis means, a cutting. Modern scholars often refer to the preposition in this instance as a preverb, rather than using the word temesis. Generally, you can think of it as just temesis as you would see it in later Attic Greek. The meter is in dactylic hexameter. Now, hexameter means it's got 6 feet, and each one is a dactyl. And a dactyl consists of one long followed by 2 short syllables. And you have 6 of these. The last one is generally either long short, or I generally take it as long long, even though the last vowel might be short. Now you generally decide whether a vowel is, a syllable is long or short by simply noting that if you've got a long vowel or diphthong, it's generally long, and if you've got a short vowel, then it's going to be short. If you have a short vowel followed by 2 consonants, then it's thought that the second consonant closes, the first consonant closes off that syllable and makes it long. So it's going to be long if it's a long vowel or diphthong, or a vowel followed by 2 consonants. Now, to break the monotony of that rhythm, we also can replace 2 of these short syllables with one long one, and that forms a spondy, which is 2 long syllables, and sometimes you'll get a tribruch as well. Just as an example of that, we'll have a look at an example of that just by doing the first couple of lines, scanning the first couple of lines. So to read out the first line, it is andra moi enepe musa polutropon hosmala polla. And you can see in the first syllable we have an alpha followed by two consonants, so it's long. And then dra moi, now you will say, well hang on, this is a diphthong, it should be long. But by a process, I think it's generally known as corruption, the long diphthong here is going to be pronounced quickly as it's sung and counts as a short syllable. So it's andra moyim ennepe, and so on. This first line is a perfect example of this dactylic hexameter. It's full of dactyls all the way along and then the spondy at the end. The second line, similarly, we have plunk because I've got two consonants. Now, although that is a long vowel, it's taken as short in pronunciation because you need to make a dactyl there. So it's plunk the epe. And now, instead of having a dactyl here, we have two long syllables, and that makes a spondy. Then we get another dactyl, another dactyl, another dactyl, and then a spondy at the end. The next line is rather heavy in the beginning. It's got two spondies starting you off. So it's polon, andro, porn, iden, askia, kai, non, kai, no, on, egno. And so when you've got lots of these very heavy spondies in a line, the line is meant to be more serious and plodding as you move along. We're not going to do too much more in regard to this, but just to mention as to how the thing works. So to come to our first few lines, we'll try and get a couple of lines done of this in the first video. I will go fairly slowly initially, and then as we get further in, I'll speed up a little bit. So the poet begins with an invocation to the muse. So we get musa, which is a vocative. We don't really know the precise etymology of musa. Scholars think it may have something to do with the goddess of memory, which is appropriate because the bard is reciting all this from memory, and what better goddess to invoke at the beginning than a goddess of memory. So this is our vocative here. Our main verb is enepe, which here is an imperative. Normally there's only one nu in this verb, it's enepo. When you look it up in the dictionary with one nu, they've doubled the nu here to make this a long syllable here for the sake of meter. This happens typically in Homer. Now, the whole poem begins with andra, which is just a man. And of course, that man is Odysseus. And Odysseus is the subject of the entire work. And so Homer very cleverly begins with andra, the very vague word a man, which is going to be the subject of the entire epic. Even in the first few books where Telemachus is more the person of interest, almost every line you can see behind it Odysseus. People are talking about Odysseus. And so Homer begins with that. Much in the same way in the Iliad, he begins with the word manis, or the raging anger of Achilles, which is the theme of the Iliad. Okay, so the first line here says, O muse. Enepe is this imperative from enepo. It's connected with an Indo-European root sek, which survives in the German sagen, and comes into English as the word say, or to tell, and that's what this word means. So it's tell moi to me, O muse, of the andra of the man who is polutropon. Now polutropon is a word whose meaning is again debated, often translated resourceful, much travelled. The trop root is the verb from the verb of turning, from trepo, turn. So this is one who was turned in many directions, i.e. much travelled. So you can see the connections here. If someone is much travelled in the ancient world, you would need to be very resourceful, and that's what Odysseus is. So, tell to me, O Muse, of this very resourceful man, or this much travelled man. Hos malapola plunk there. Now this is an example of, in the next sentence here, this is an example of what's called enjambment. So enjambment, which is a word that you may have come across, it's used in poetry, enjambment. What it means is that you take the key word, or you take a word from one line and you hold it off and you delay it until the beginning of the next line so that it really hits you. And Homer does this very frequently. Normally each line is self-contained, sometimes two lines together self-contained, and sometimes you have a line which is almost self-contained except one word is delayed and it comes and whacks you at the beginning of the next line. Now the verb here is plasdo, and plasdo means I wander, and we have here the aorist passive. Now of course the verb to wander is not a verb, it's an intransitive verb, so it doesn't really go into the passive. So some people will either take this as passive for middle, or perhaps I think more sensibly is to see this as a kind of causative, to be caused to wander. He didn't really have a lot of choice in the matter. So hos malapola, pola is neuter plural, that's an adverb here, which I generally translate using an archaic English for muchly. It's a shame we lost that word in our language. It's very useful in translating Homer. And the mala is intensitive here, who very muchly was caused to wander. So tell to me, O Muse, of that resourceful man who was caused to wander very muchly. Some people just translate this as active, as wandered. Epe, when. Now our next verb is at the end of the line. And notice, by the way, this verb was missing the augment, even though it's an aorist passive, no augment. This verb at the end of the line here has the augment. This is from the verb pertho, I sack. And so this is the aorist form here. So when he had sacked the sacred Ptolethron citadel Troyes of Troy. So, those first two lines, tell to me, O Muse, of that man, that very resourceful man, who wandered muchly, or was caused to wander very muchly, when he had sacked the sacred citadel of Troy. And I'll continue with this in the next video.